Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Today we're going to discuss, in a moment, 5 albums I hope Tone Poet reissues. And we already know their schedule for the next 16 months or something. But these are albums I'm hoping that down the pike will get on the list, and I'm pretty certain most of them will at some point, as long as this wave of popularity continues to crest for Blue Note and vinyl. I don't see jazz vinyl resales dropping off anytime in the near future. Jazz has always had a pretty strong vinyl community around it, and so I think it's going to probably be something that will be with us for a while, and great for that. First, though, I want to address something. To understand jazz, I think it's very important that we do discuss race from time to time. And this is a great Bud Shank record. Barefoot Adventure. They make, I believe it's for a soundtrack. Yep. And obviously it's one of those West Coast surfer films. And if you listen to the tonality of this, it's fairly bright. It's fairly light, buoyant. And I think people so often get hung up on the instrument versus how that instrument being voiced. These guys are playing a traditional band setting, and there's some great playing on here. And of course it's for a surf film, but it still has such a light nature to it. It swings, but it swings light. There's some great guitar playing, by the way, by a guy we didn't cover in my jazz guitar series, a guy by the name of Dennis Budimir, who I've heard of from time to time. I have some of his side work, but again, nothing by him as a leader. But I'd completely forgotten about Charles Budimir, or Denny Budimir. Great player. It's a fun record. Bud Shank's on it, Shelly Manne, the great Carmel Jones, Bob Cooper, Gary Peacock's on the bass. Just all around, it's a really solid, fun, light session, and shows you some elements of swing. Just the swinging nature of what a jazz quintet can do. But a lot of people are out there talking about how I don't like jazz with strings. It feels light. I don't like strings in my jazz. And it's not about any given instrument. You can inflect the blues and sorrow in any instrument if you have the blues and have sorrow. These cats playing this here on the West Coast are comfortable. It's interesting how Tone Poet owns Pacific and Blue Note, which were both, I believe, United Artists Liberty purchases. And so they're kind of being coupled together here on the Tone Poet reissues, just like OJC has Riverside and Contemporary and Prestige. United Artists ended up with both Pacific and that's why you see sometimes Pacific and Blue Note lumped together on the Mosaic stuff as well. This was about what do you have the licensing to, and a lot of the Blue Note titles sold really poorly compared to the Pacific titles, which were destined for white audiences, and it means a lot fewer Pacific titles need to be reissued. And you're doing it more so people can have a nice quality heavy modern pressing with a nice gatefold. You're not doing it as much because people don't have access to this stuff anywhere else, which with a lot of Blue Note reissue programs, that's why they're being driven. People can't find the old Mobleys, the old Morgans, the old whatever you got. The Pacific stuff's not that hard to find, but they're still issuing some cool Pacific stuff, and there's some cool stuff coming, including Katanga is coming down the road, which I'll probably grab that when it finally comes out. But to drive that home here, I enjoyed this record a lot as I played it yesterday. But again, it was constantly clear to me these were white guys. They were swinging pretty hard, but it's still kind of light in its feel. And I've heard many people talk about how strings and jazz don't belong together, but I'm going to show you something. Sounds like what, a bass flute maybe? Or a baritone flute? some light strings there, some cellos. This is Don Bias, a brother who left America, went to Paris, lived in Europe for 2-3 decades, and kind of became a forgotten entity here in America. This is him recording with strings in Paris. Now listen. Oh, the sorrow, the longing. Even though he's living in Europe, there's still a great sorrow in him for what he's experienced. It's not like racism doesn't exist in Europe. It's just much less so than what's in America. And on top of that, I've read that many of the black players who lived in Europe for decades longed for home and their black communities and neighborhoods the whole time they were in Europe. And that's what usually would pull them back home, was to be in the company of their black fellowship. And they missed those black enclaves with black cooking and food, black music and clubs, the black fashion sense. A lot of that you'd be detached from living in Europe in the 30s and 40s and 50s. You know, the internet doesn't exist in that same way. So you're not even keeping up on the lingo of your people in your streets. And so you pine for home. You long for that place where you belong. And thank God Europe opened their doors and hearts and arms to so many of these black American jazz players. But the notion that you can't play soulfully with strings is put to rest. And Clifford Brown puts it to rest. Charlie Parker puts it to rest. I think Cannonball Adderley with strings is a great record. But I got this Don Bias recently, which is it's a Riverside thing. It's on Battle, which is a subsidiary of Riverside. I'm guessing it was licensed from a European label. I haven't really looked into it that deeply yet. I'm pretty sure that would be the case. So it's recorded in Paris, but doesn't say what label. I didn't look that close yet, but they certainly didn't go over to Europe and record it themselves. So it's just filled with fantastic, throat-grabbing moments from a guy who's playing with strings. And yet it's gut-wrenching. It's absolutely intense, sobering, filled with longing, desperation. And so, again, it's not about the instrumentation. It's about what's fueling and who's playing said instruments that can determine the outcome of any setting. And it's why a guy like Armstrong can be put in any place and just exude soul and exuberance and passion and fire, because he wasn't limited to the setting you placed him in. He was ambivalent and oblivious to it. I wanted to marry those two words together, ambivalent. But he was oblivious and ambivalent towards whatever setting he was put in. Because he knew when he put that trumpet to his lips, sweet salvation awaited around that corner, and he was going to deliver that message. Don't matter what you put me in, you dress me any way you want. Once this comes to my lips, I'm going to speak some truth, I'm going to spit some fire, and I'm going to acknowledge my place in this cosmos and my condition as a human, and I'm going to share things from my soul that's going to be so honest and filled with integrity that it will have a staying power. And ultimately in art, the greatest measuring stick is the integrity of said artist. Whether it's a painter, a sculptor, an architect even, but music, especially in writing, the integrity of the artist. You know, when music's just fueled by making money or showing off my ability, my ego, it's a different engine. But when it's fueled by my expression of what's inside of me that I need to get out, by the pain and the haunting that I can't seem to manage. A lot of these people didn't have access to medications and therapy, psychoanalysis. For them, picking that horn up was that. And I think anybody who wants to have an interesting bit of insight into the experiences in America, and this goes for Americans as well as Europeans here, to look at the experience of the teen in this country, we watched, me and my family yesterday watched The Outsiders, a great film with an incredible cast, and it showed the difference between the greasers and the socias in Tulsa, Oklahoma back in the 50s, the economic divide that tears us all apart, the haves versus the have-nots, and the pain and sorrow of being loved versus not being loved. We also watched Stand By Me, which has some of that same teen angst in it, but not the same way that The Outsiders really kind of hits home, you know. And what a cast. Young Tom Cruise, young Rob Lowe, Patrick Swayze, Ralph Macchio, Emilio Estevez. It just kind of goes on and on, you know. It's a pretty incredible ensemble, all young in their beginnings of their careers. And you see them all together in this cast, and it's pretty powerful. So The Outsiders is a great look at what the white experience looked like when you were poor. And then, conversely, when you look at a show like The Wire, who I mentioned probably a month or so ago, and if you've never seen The Wire, it's one of the greatest television shows of all time. Any list of the greatest TV shows of all time will have The Wire top 2 or 3, if not number 1. It's pretty much one of the pinnacles of the medium of television and storytelling and honest and art and integral art. It really says an honest story about inner urban American decay, the failings of the system, bureaucracy. The honesty of it's refreshing. There's not really good and bad characters. Everybody's both equally. So even the ones that we think would have nobility in their characters or in their purposes, their true deviousness is revealed continuously. And even those we would see as the underbelly of society, we see that their intentions are often noble. And so it has an honest introspection into poverty, desperation, police, government, the schools. It really touches on a lot of things. And in season 4, they talk about the schools a lot. And they covered 4 young black youths who are 8th graders, essentially. And to see what they experience in their day-to-day life. And if you want to have some understanding of what the jazz age was like and what young black youths go through in America, The Wire will really give you some great insight into that. And this is happening in the early 2000s. But what's important to recognize that unlike the white American experience, where there's a great difference in the lifestyles of white Americans. And the Italians had it worse, the Irish had it worse, but even those folks could integrate more into white neighborhoods and climb their way up the social ladder. There was a great difference between living on the Upper East Side, being a wealthy New Yorker, versus being a Long Islander, versus being in New England, versus being in rural America. But white people filled all those places. So there's many different white cultures and communities that come about, each with their own struggle and experience. But the one thing that doesn't really change is the inner experience of the black Americans. They didn't have multiple different settings and surroundings within which they existed. They pretty much all was herded into the poorest neighborhoods of a decaying city, and then oftentimes they were used to help further blight that neighborhood, to further drive down property values, to further drive down the tax base so that crime would increase and the policing would decrease, allowing that entire area to eventually become condemned and to allow it to be redeveloped without them having to pay much of anything for it. It's a great crime what's happened. So many areas were intentionally racially forced upon certain people. In New York, they redlined areas. And so we're going to force blacks to move there and drive down the property of that neighborhood until the fact we can condemn most of it, tear it down, and redevelop it and move these people all out. This was done by intent, not by just coincidence and happenstance, but this was actually a mapped out philosophy of governance in one of the most liberal cities in America. And that same thing plays out across America. As freeway systems were built in the 50s and 60s, they tore through neighborhoods, and the little cut off chunks that had no value anymore, blacks were told to go live there. They were cut off from the rest of the cities by these freeways and concrete obstructions that isolated them from white neighborhoods. and forced them into poor schools and poor police neighborhoods, and the remaining whites in those neighborhoods couldn't help but flee. And white flight's an incredible, it's an incredible slice of this story. Whites moved out of neighborhoods that had minorities flocking into them. The whites flocked away, and with them went the tax base, and the services for the city went with them. Because without a tax base, we can't hire more police. So as crime increases, the services actually decrease, and it all leads to this cycle of eventual foreclosures, reseizing, and redevelopment. That's part of a really sad and awful existence. But the Black American experience, whether it's 2005 or 1945, isn't that different. They live in these inner city neighborhoods. Their idea of games and toys was a stick and a ball, or playing with a fire hydrant. This is not just stereotypes. These people lived on their stoops and their stairs and their porches, and were often frightened to leave the neighborhoods they were subjected to live in. And so when you watch The Wire, you can actually get some empathy for what the Black experience was like. And remembering that Miles Davis living on a suburban rural farm with his dad being a dentist, that was a rare thing. And it's Miles' identity is very isolated from the rest of the jazz community, in large part because of that experience. He doesn't really know the hood, the projects, the ghetto. He never really had that lifestyle, and he didn't want to be even labeled or affiliated with that for various reasons, some of which I can understand. He wanted to be seen as an artist and not by his race. But America's not that. America's not that black and white in some ways. You can have money and have some privilege, but if you're black, you're still black. And that's why Jay-Z said a couple years ago how he's still an N-word. I mean, no matter what I am, how much money I got, I'm still going to be a nigger to you. And it's a sad moment of revelation for a black man to wake up and realize that, damn, I'm condemned to live in this skin, in a place, in a time that's going to treat me as less human. And so The Outsiders is a great film to look at what white privilege versus lack of privilege looks like, and the struggle that even the poorest whites had in America and still do. But it kind of pales in comparison to what the black kids were going through in the inner cities, and how, the white kid still has sorrow. He ends up killing a Soch and having to go live in a burned out barn, or a church actually. And, there's some sadness and sorrow, no question about it. But it's not the same as these black kids in The Wire living on this back stoop in an alleyway with gunshots and violence and police breaking fingers and preying on them. It's kind of eye-opening. So I recommend The Outsiders if you haven't seen it, but I think most people probably have seen it. It's a very highly rated film. And again, if you have not seen The Wire, I promise you, if you want to understand jazz better, The Wire will help you get there. And it's not about jazz. A lot of it's about black experience in America. Coming from the eyes of David Simon, who was a Baltimore Sun columnist. He followed the police beats for decades. He was well informed what was happening in the schools, government, police departments, the passing of the buck. So he gives us really honest revelation of what is broken in the American city. And it's that broken bureaucracy that is so interwoven into why the black experience is what it is. So anyway, Don Bias, this is a fantastic record, and by a fantastic player who Americans forget. And it reveals that in no way does the instrument that is chosen to back me or surround me going to impact what I'm speaking through my horn. I might be a spray painter, but if you give me pastels, I'm still going to say my story. So I can't recommend it enough. And I think some of the blanket statements people make about jazz with strings or players with strings is often showing a lack of perception and a lack of just listening. It can still speak to you and move you. And we all like a groove, and there's no question that these young white cats can lay down a groove. Yet, that fantastic Don Bias is darker and moves me far more than these white cats do. And it's not, again, it's not a criticism of the white cats. They can't fake their expression. You know, you come from where you come from. But that's just, I just want to share that about that record's powerful. And I think I'm going to include that Don Bias in my next Throat Grabbers because I just love it so much. Now we're going to dive into 5, potentially 6 track albums I'd love to see Tone Poet reissue. And number 1 is Ike Quebec. The album was called Congo Lament. It was pulled off release, and it did come out later on, I think with a few tracks of something else, but it was never issued in its proper format with a right cover and the proper attention that it deserves. And I'd like to see Ike Quebec's 45s as well reissued in a Tone Poet reissue at some point, because that's a whole set of stuff from the early 50s, late 40s that isn't really accessible to most people. I know Mosaic did it, and there's a CD session with them compiled, but that's also something that I would like to see. But Congo Lament, that's one of the top things I've always kind of wanted to have. And I do have a Japanese pressing with the songs. I think most of them are on there, if not all of them, but it needs a proper issuing. And Ike Quebec needs a little more light shone on him anyway. Just a great lyrical ballad player. He channels the Ben Websters and Coleman Hawkins. Just a beautiful blues speaker, you know, and the world could always use more blues. Number 2 on my list is by Grant Green, and he's already had a number of reissues on Tone Poet, and Music Matters has done some as well. And Music Matters might have actually already done this, but I'm not paying $100 for it for 45. I don't want that. I want Gooden's Corner, and I don't have that in any format, and it was never issued in the initial Blue Note sequence. But I'd like to eventually see Tone Poet reissue that great Grant Green session, and all Grant Green to me has a place and a value. If you just watch my series on the great guitar and jazz and the history and evolution of the electric guitar, I kind of came to the conclusion and realization through that process that of all the jazz guitars, Grant Green's probably the darkest, the moodiest, the most broody, the most blue. You know, there's a darkness and a weight to Grant Green's stuff, in part because of the sessions he's with and the men he's playing with, that most jazz guitar lacks. Wes Montgomery, as great as he's often a very light, fluffy setting. The great Kenny Burrell is in infinite different settings, and so you don't hear him in that dark trio quartet setting very often. You do at times, but Grant Green's continual body of work has a nice darkness to it that just cooks in the background. So anything by Grant Green, I think, especially from the 60s, is of great value. And then, of course, his first session also, I'm sure is due to get a Tone Poet reissue. It was recorded in '61, if I recall, and they sat on it because they were excited to hire Grant Green. Alfred was really impressed by him when he heard him in his audition. And usually Alfred Lyon would make you be a session guy, sideman, on a few sessions before you got your own. But he actually gives Grant Green his first session right off the bat as a leader. And that first session got shelved because there was some nerves. There was some, he just wasn't comfortable, you know, which is, I mean, if you start off the bat as a leader, of course you're going to be a little uncomfortable, you know. It's like coming to bat for the Yankees. If you've never been a big league ball player before, and you're leading off for the Yankees. You know, I mean, you're going to be a little nervous. But it's still a great session. I've heard it. And it was reissued again later, probably in the 80s again as well. So I think that's also deserving of a release at some point. But it's not one of my official numbers here. Ike, Grant Green, Sonny Clark, Blues in the Night. Sonny Clark, for some reason, there's a lot of Clark stuff, both him as a leader and as a sideman, that got sat on. And slowly a lot of that stuff's starting to show up. Tone Poet's already put some of it out. And anything with Sonny Clark on it is of great value. You know, Sonny Clark to me is probably the darkest guy in the Blue Note roster in some ways. He just has this intensity and this, it feels like he has this leadership over sessions that imparts his sincerity, his dedication, his integrity, and his passion for change. You just feel like there's a motivation in Sonny Clark that inspires the men he's working with. And they kind of take on this unified, aggressive positivity. And you might think aggressive, how's that positive? when you need change, sometimes you have to have an aggressive positivity. And Sonny Clark just seems to be this fist raised, defiant, I'm not going to live and tolerate what I've been given. I'm going to demand more, even if it costs me in my lifetime, to hopefully make the next generation's life better. And boy, change is incremental. It comes in fits and starts, and we make some progress, and then we take a jump back. There's an entire elite structure that, through the media, proliferates race to keep our country from finding unity. If we had unity and didn't see religion and race and all these things that divide us, we would realize that we all share kind of a common interest in what we really want, and democracy would function. But we're so uneducated that we can be so easily misinformed, and that fear is so easy to fill the mind of ignorance and keep us divided. And that's one of the great tragedies. And Sonny Clark, to me, almost just has an importance to him. There's just a meaning and a purpose to it. And so I'd like to see that Blues in the Night record. There's also a few other Sonny Clark sessions as well that I would like to see issued and put out by Tone Poet. But Blues in the Night is one that really comes to mind. And I think there's one coming next year from Sonny Clark that's already on the list to be. And I didn't want to include anything that's already scheduled to be released. And there's some good stuff coming there, like Mobley's Curtain Call. I think it's Jackknife by Jackie McLean. McLean's got a lot of records from the mid to late 60s that Blue Note sat on as the label was kind of going into approaching the sale. A lot of sessions just didn't make it out. So there's a lot of Jackie McLean stuff that could probably be reissued. Dexter Gordon, Landslide. Anything Dexter Gordon does in this period to me is golden. I just love his confidence, his maturity. He's not blustering and trying to be Rollins and Coltrane. He's just sitting back and speaking from Dexter Gordon's place in space. And that's an important thing. A lot of these guys in jazz try to emulate what's happening, what's hot, what's hip. You know what I mean? I gotta be cool. And you can sometimes sacrifice your own message, your own delivery, by trying to understand what's going on in the mainstream. I think Miles compromises himself all the time by trying to be hip. And Dexter Gordon, by this point in his career, he doesn't care what the kids are doing. He's going to be Dexter, and he's going to speak from that place, which gives it an honesty. And so anything Dexter does on Blue Note to me is, of course, very worthwhile. The Clubhouse session's already come out, and I have a Japanese pressing of that too, but I've never gotten the Landslide. And I think it's actually culled from a few different sessions, but I think it'd be worthwhile to have. And again, for $25 or whatever it is, always worthwhile. Art Blakey, Afrocane. Anything Art Blakey to me is the Blue Note sound. Along with Horace Silver, that body of Jazz Messenger work and the roots and the branches of the Jazz Messenger tree, that defines Blue Note. It's not the later avant-garde stuff, you know what I mean? It's not Ornette Coleman, you know what I mean? It's not the early Miles and Monk stuff, as important as then some of those recordings are. It's the Jazz Messenger tree, the roots of it, and then the branches of it. That is what the Blue Note sound is. The tempo of it, the bluesiness of it, the grooving nature of it, the pulsing, frenetic rhythms that have this urgency. And if you wanted to define Blakey and his crew with one word, urgency would probably be it. And so Afrocane's another session that was released in Japan at some point. And a lot of these were issued in the 80s and even in America in the 1000 series, which had those awful white frame covers with photographs in them. Why the jazz industry didn't know how to make a good album cover after 1970, I'm not sure. You know, aside from CTI, who made great covers, jazz post 1970, you could count the number of good album covers on one hand. And that's converse to the 50s, when all the good record covers in the music industry were all jazz covers. Ain't nobody else making cool album covers. Jazz was making cutting edge album covers in the 1950s that are just landmark album covers in graphic design, typography, how we laid things out. It's all of it was very cutting edge and innovative. And so we definitely got to look at Blakey's work, and that should come out, and I'm sure it will at some point here. And then last but not least, this is a bonus. They've already put out 2 Hutcherson records with The Kicker, and I can't think of the other one right now. They put 2 Hutcherson records out, Bobby Hutcherson records out, but there's another one called Medina that I've always wanted to hear. I've not heard it. It's from like 67 or 68, I think, 66. So it's right towards the end of the Blue Note era. And I think it'd be worth having that added to the Tone Poet playset as well. But my 5 are the Art Blakey Afrocane, Dexter Gordon Landslide, Simon Clark Blues in the Night, Grant Green Gooden's Corner, and Ike Quebec Congo Lament. Tone Poet, if you're listening, please get those 5 on your agenda. I'm sure they'd all be well welcomed and received, and all 5 of those artists deserve all the light we can put on them. And congrats to the Tone Poet for doing the great job that they do. It's such a welcome thing to have these deluxe packages coming out at a reasonable price. And that's the coolest thing about it. That's why you can say F you to Music Matters. $100 a record, you're not really embracing people buying this stuff. You're being elitist. And a lot of the biggest fans of true art aren't wealthy. The wealthy who can afford true art are often kind of posing, trying to be hip when they're not. You know, a lot of the true people who feel art and need art to help express their own experiences, they often excluded from great art by the pricing. And I think shame on them for making that stuff so unattainable. It's, to me, it's inexcusable. To put on music like jazz that was for the people, that was meant to be ministering to the people, and to make it that expensive, it's insulting. It's insulting, and it speaks of greed. And there's no way it costs that much for you to do that stuff. And I know it costs money to license the Blue Note name, and but Tone Poet's doing it for $27. So at most, your record should be $50 for those double LPs, but it's not my place to say, I guess. You know, no one's asking me. So those are the 5 I would like to see, along with a few others there. And keep in mind, watch The Outsiders if you've never seen it, and if you've never seen The Wire, take the time. It's only 5 seasons. It goes by really quick. It's HBO, so there's only like 13 episodes, 12 episodes every year, and it will absolutely help you understand life for the average American black man in America. And that story will translate through the decades seamlessly and tell you what almost all the young black musicians grew up experiencing, and why heroin was like it was, you know, and why hustling and prison and violence, why it all became such a daily part of their lives, and the normalcy of it. So y'all be safe. We'll talk to y'all soon. Appreciate you all. Again, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you want to support the channel and help us out, go to Patreon and pledge up to $5, $10 a month. Just helps supporting the channel, helping me have time to do it, you know. And there's also some great t-shirts and hoodies at the Teespring Jazz Shepherd page. You can go there and buy some cool merchandise, and that also helps us out a little bit with some money. So I hate to ask for money, but times are tough right now. I'm sure they are for a lot of you. So there's no obligation, of course. It's just if you got it, it's appreciated. Y'all be blessed. Talk to you all soon. Keep loving your hearts. Jazz Shepherd out. Talk to you soon. Peace.